battle for Manila, capital city of the Philippines, was one of great street fighting battles of the Second World War, listed with Stalingrad and Berlin in terms of its ferocity and destruction. The city, once said to be the Pearl of the Orient, famed for 300 years of Western architectural heritage centered around the mini Vatican City, at the heart called Intramuros, to be utterly devastated. The American push to liberate Manila, but the Japanese resistance led to a tragedy of human civilization on a scale and brutality yet to be seen. As they began losing the battle, the Imperial Japanese Navy defenders take out their frustrations on the local civilian population, on an orgy of rape and murder compared even to that committed on the innocent inhabitants of the Chinese capital city of Nanking in 1937 by the Japanese sailors who ran amok, deliberately torturing and murdering as many innocents as they could lay their hands on. It was truly Manila's Gurta de Marin, the Japanese Navy's darkest hour in the waning months of the war in the Pacific. On the 9th of January 1945, Lieutenant Walter Kruger's U.S. 6th Army landed at Lingayen Gulf. The Japanese Navy's greatest war crime set into motion.
6th Army forces en route with the 7th Fleet to northern Luzon. Objective, to take the American flag back to Manila. U.S. guns battle Jap planes and 2 Jap destroyers, attempting to break into our convoy of more than 800 vessels. The camera, 6 miles from the action, records direct hits on the enemy vessels. Enemy air attacks off Lingayen Gulf. Lost to the enemy, 79 planes. A 3-day naval bombardment of the entire Lingayen Gulf area. On S-Day, 9th January, a 2-hour bombardment is concentrated on Lingayen Gulf's southern coast. Our landing forces move toward shore almost unmolested, spearheading the greatest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. About 900 amphibious tanks, tractors, and ducks, and 2,500 LCVPs and similar craft were lowered into the Gulf. Pre-invasion minesweeping had revealed few underwater obstacles. Up to 100,000 men, under the command of Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, made landings at 4 points along a wide stretch of beach.
General Douglas MacArthur had promised that the Americans would return after the defeat in 1942, and returned they did, with an army and firepower which the world had never seen. Lieutenant Walter Krugers immediately began driving to the south on 31st of January. Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, 8th Army landed unopposed at Nasugbu in southern Luzon, slowly moving toward Manila. The strongest element in Eichelberger's command was Major General Joseph Swings, 11th Airborne Division and Colonel, and Hardrock Hogan and the 11th Airborne's 511th Regimental Combat Team led the attack at a daring parachute drop. The Japanese had failed to give the challenge to prevent the Americans' advance to the capital, with intact bridges and shallow rivers to cross. Converging American forces had set off from February 4th, 1945, but the result was hopeless. To find out that every inch in Manila and street by street and house by house, they need to fight the Japanese army if necessary. Overall in charge in the Philippines was General Tamiyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya. The legendary general who, with fewer troops, had conquered the Malayan Peninsula and Singapore from the British in February 1942. The 14th Area Army of the Japanese was broken down into various forces, with the troops garrisoning Manila being made of the Shimbu Force, under the command of Lieutenant General Shizuo Yokoyama, as well as a large Japanese naval force known as the 31st Naval Base Force, under the command of Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, covering the port and naval installations throughout the city and also garrisoned in Manila. The future of Manila posed a problem of inter-service rivalry and insular politics between the Imperial Army and Navy. General Yamashita had overall authority of the Philippines. The naval forces under the command of 14th Area Army were under a separate command structure. Iwabuchi would report to his own service Chief Vice Admiral Denshichi Okochi, commander of the Southwestern Area Fleet in the Philippines. Rather than reporting to General Yamashita, reported straight back to the combined fleet in Japan. General Yamashita was well aware of the foolishness of sending his forces into urban fighting against the Americans. With their own superior air, power, artillery, and armor, it would erase his mobility and ability to strike his foe. Furthermore, there was the issue of feeding upwards of 1 million citizens still in the city when the Americans arrived, a task impossible for the poorly organized Japanese logistics network to manage. Yamashita ordered General Yokoyama to withdraw his troops from the city and towards the mountains of northern Luzon, where a stand could be made. Yokoyama theoretically had command over the forces of the Imperial Navy, also stationed in the city under Admiral Iwabuchi, and he ordered Iwabuchi to withdraw as well. When Iwabuchi's superior Vice Admiral Okochi heard of Yamashita's order to withdraw, he ordered Iwabuchi to hold the naval installations and Nichols Airfield in Manila to the last man. Iwabuchi informed Iwabuchi that the 31st Special Naval Base Force, along with the crews of the Japanese ships in the harbor and assorted naval support personnel, would amalgamate and form a new unit known as the Manila Naval Defense Force, the MNDF. This was a hastily formed unit ill-suited to take on the crack of the U.S. Army in Manila. Although the 31st Naval Special Base Force of infantry-trained soldiers provided the bulk of the troops, the remainder had little or no rifle training, outside of some light drill and weapons handling. With the withdrawal of General Yokoyama's Shimbu Group, the withdrawal of supporting armor, and most of the heavy weapons and artillery in the city, and any even remotely trained land warfare officer, left the MNDF of 17,000 men to scrounge whatever armaments they could find. Aside from the reasonably well-armed with rifles 31st Naval Special Base Force, the sailors of the MNDF were largely unarmed, with the long storage in Manila of American Springfield 1903 rifles since the defeat of 1942 being issued to them. In addition to heavy machine guns, hand grenades, anti-aircraft guns, and field artillery were collected and handed out to the naval troops. Still, when placed up against the artillery and armored formations of the United States, which would soon march against them, the sailors were poorly equipped. The limit of their advantage was the fact that the Americans would have to try and engage them in urban fighting, meaning the Japanese could create hundreds of static defenses, traps, and obstacles for the Americans to clear. The second advantage the Japanese has is 17,000 men willing to die in the battle for Manila. They were no easy feat. On the 3rd of February 1945, elements of the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division under Major General Vern Demudge entered the northern suburbs of Manila, capturing a key bridge across the Tuliahan River. The water features separating American forces from the city proper. Japanese defenses had been laid out to cover both sections of the city. Army troops were involved in the defense. As I said earlier, General Yamashita had given into Iwabuchi's demands that the vital naval installations in the city he placed under Admiral Iwabuchi, and a few thousand soldiers under the command of Colonel Katsuzo Noguchi detachment were ordered to dig in north of the Pasig. The defense of Manila was, however, primarily a two-force by the Japanese Navy. Iwabuchi deployed 4,500 representatives of his force to reinforce Colonel Noguchi across the Pasig, and a further 5,000 under Iwabuchi's personal command would hold the southern Pasig. With another 5,000 formed at Fort McKinley and Nichols Airfield, a few thousand more were deployed into naval ships in Manila Bay, or on the eastern side of the city. The primary army troops, or Shimbu Group, hiding in the mountains after the bridge across the Tuliahan River, fell into American hands. The 1st American Forces, Manila Force, was the squadron of military Brigadier General Chases of 8th Cavalry Brigade, drove into the campus of University of Santo Tomas, and immediately hit trouble. The university had been turned into a massive civilian internment camp. The civilian internment rate had been slightly over 10%, with 466 of the 4,255 prisoners dying. At 9 p.m., Chase's men stormed the camp and engaged the guards as Sherman tanks crashed through the university's walls. Placed under pressure, Lieutenant Colonel Toshio Hayashi fell back along with his 46 men and a large group of internees to the education building. Demanding safe passage for himself and his men to rejoin Japanese troops to the south of the city, Hayashi threatened to kill his hostages if the Americans didn't allow his demands. On the 5th of February, the Americans begrudgingly complied, and the hostages were released. After exchanging salutes, the Japanese were escorted to their own lines. As fate would have it, Hayashi and his men arrived at the area around the Malacanang Palace. Already held by American forces, and in the fighting that followed, Hayashi and many of his men were killed. The rest returned to Santo Tomas as prisoners, themselves. As General MacArthur proclaimed the imminent recapture of Manila, his divisional commanders reported stiffening resistance by Japanese forces. To the north and the south of the city, Uebuchi's men had heavily fortified their sectors of the city, including the ancient heart, the Intramuros, with barbed wire entanglements, minefields, trench systems, and roadblocks. It would take the Americans a month of bloodshed to clear the city of its Japanese Navy and Army defenders. To the north, General Griswold and his men coursed south out of Santo Tomas University. Towards the Pasig River, the 2nd Squadron of the 5th Cavalry was tasked with seizing the intact Quezon Bridge, late on the 4th of February, but was defeated by strong Japanese resistance. The next day, the 37th Infantry Division began its advance into Manila, Griswold dividing the city into 2 halves, giving the western half to the 37th and the eastern half to the 1st Cavalry Division. By the 8th of February, units from the 37th Division had cleared the majority of Japanese defenders from their assigned sector. But the tactics they employed also killed thousands of innocent civilians, because the Japanese had committed to a house-to-house resistance. When the Americans encountered dug-in defenders, they just leveled the building using artillery and tank support. Street after street was destroyed by this method, resulting in massive civilian casualties, as well as destroying the city's infrastructure and architecture. The Japanese also contributed to the destruction, and as troops withdrew, they blew up buildings. As they did so, the Japanese naval troops dug in on Proviso Island, an industrial center on the Pasig River, put up a fierce resistance lasting until the 11th of February. Atrocities against the civilian population were also being perpetrated by the Japanese, even while American attacks were increasingly threatening their lines. Time was running out for the savage occupation of Manila. In the east, General Major's 5th Cavalry was experiencing heavy fighting. The 7th and 8th Cavalry fought bitter battles for control over 2 water supply complexes within the northern section of the city. By the 10th of February, the Americans had crossed the passage and were establishing their hold over most of the city. However, the Japanese retained strong defenses within the Intramuros, Nichols Field, and Fort McKinley. The 11th Airborne Division had been held before the airfield since the 4th of February, where Japanese naval troops, strongly supported by their limited field artillery, had kept the Americans at bay. Nichols Field finally fell to the American paratroopers on the 11th of February, an important victory that permitted General Swing to encircle Manila completely. And by the end of the 12th, trapped like rats, the Japanese continued to resist heavily. But now, they also made the decision to begin an orgy of rape and murder inside of the parts of the city which remained under their control, in what came to be known as the Manila Massacre. Commander of the Southwest Area Fleet, now safely headquartered with General Yamashita in Baguio City, received a radio message from the surrounded Admiral Iwabuchi on the 18th of February. Quote, "I am overwhelmed with shame for the number of casualties among my subordinates, and for my incompetence, which resulted in my failure to fulfill my duty. Now, as long as we have strength remaining, we will engage the enemy decisively. Banzai for the Emperor." Unquote. There would be no surrender of the Japanese. As Iwabuchi radioed, "We are determined to fight to the last man." The motivation of the Japanese defenders now was nothing to look forward to except their own deaths in combat. And for many, this grim thought appears to have led to a feeling that they could do whatever they wanted to the hapless civilians awaiting liberation, and do so out of with alarming degrees of savagery and sadism. Inside the once beautiful Intramuros walled city, reduced to rubble by the Americans. The fighting continued until the 28th of February. The ancient and well-built structures provided excellent cover for the defenders, necessitating even more destruction by the Americans, who simply blew up everything in their path that showed any sign of resistance, killing thousands more civilians. As one historian has put it, quote, "American lives were understandably more valuable than historic landmarks." Unquote. The final stronghold of Japanese resistance was the Finance Building, which the Americans bombarded with heavy guns until all inside were dead. It was the 3rd of March 1945, a month since the American forces had first entered the northern suburbs of Manila. The death toll was terrifying. Around 100,000 Filipino civilians were intentionally killed by Japanese forces, and many thousands more by American attempts to retake the city. Nearly 16,000 Japanese were killed, mostly naval troops, making up for virtually their entire garrison. The Americans lost 1,010 dead and 5,565 wounded in the month-long fight, in the most brutal urban fighting in the Pacific War. While criticized by post-war Filipino government and others for the devastation they caused to the city, an American battle report noted, quote, "The destruction stemmed from the American decision to save lives in a battle against Japanese troops who decided to sacrifice their lives as dearly as possible." Unquote. General Douglas MacArthur could boast at Malacanang Palace, "After the battle, your capital city, cruelly punished though it be, has regained its rightful place, the citadel of democracy in the East." Unquote. The man held to blame for all this suffering was General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commander of the Japanese 14th Area Army. When the war ended in August 1945, Yamashita and 50,000 troops continued to resist the American advance from their positions in the mountains behind the town of Baguio. The former Tiger of Malaya had originally had an army of 300,000. Yamashita was tried for war crimes even though he had already withdrawn his army from Manila before the Americans got there, and ordered the city was not to be defended with the death of Admiral Iwabuchi. In the fighting in the city, Yamashita would take the fall for the Imperial Navy being responsible for the slaughter of civilians. Quote, "The trials certainly brought out all the horrors of the closing days of Japanese authority in Manila," recalled journalist Dennis Warner, who attended the trial in 1945, "but because the case was so hastily prepared," said Warner, "much of the evidence related to what happened to events in the city during February 1945. It felt to some of us who were reporting on that trial that in that dread period, the General Yamashita could hardly be held even responsible for command responsibility." Unquote. After 42 days of trial, Yamashita was convicted of war crimes, resulting from the outrages committed by the admirals beyond his immediate control, and he was hanged on February 23, 1946, in the vicinity of the ruins of Manila. Yamashita was, of course, responsible for the war crimes committed by army troops through the surrounding countryside against so-called guerrillas in the closing stages of the war. And of course, the British were keen to send Yamashita up for the murders of Chinese civilians and Allied prisoners of war following the fall of Singapore in 1942. Yamashita, in his defense, said that he bore no responsibility for the behavior of the Imperial Navy in Manila after he withdrew the troops. The tribunal, however, determined that because the Manila Naval Defense Force fell under the command of Yamashita's 14th Army, he must be held accountable. As Warner wrote, quote, "Justice on this occasion was perhaps not very kind." Unquote. The scale of Japanese atrocities in the Philippines came close to their activities in occupied China, with the numbers of people butchered and the material damage they wreaked on the nation. The Tokyo trial lists 72 large-scale massacres and at least 131,029 murders. As a minimum number of victims of Japanese war crimes in the Philippines, an astonishing 618 pages of sworn affidavits relating to the Philippines were collected by the American investigators, and each one detailed a different atrocity, settling who was guilty and who bore responsibility. For the guilty proved difficult, given the short time allotted for war crimes trials after the end of the war. Remarkably few Japanese responsible for committing the murders were ever tried, so that most of the convictions and/or imprisonments or executions of these Japanese officers guilty of breaches of command responsibility took the form of failing to control their men in time of war,